Welcome to the channel, everyone. In this video, I'm going to talk about weld-through primer, the benefits of it, some of the problems associated with it as far as using it and welding through it. And also we're going to test some stuff. I got a couple test panels we're going to weld together and see what happens with it. So the first thing I want to talk about, before I started this video, I wanted to find out as much information on this weld-through primer as I could. And I'm using SEM brand here. They don't sponsor this video. I bought it on Amazon. I use it on that 57 Chevy where I replaced the floor pans. So I'm looking at this can here and I see an 800 number, so I called it. And I like doing that with all kinds of different things. If I've buy a product and it doesn't work like I think it should, I always call the company and usually get some kind of technical support. I've talked to engineers at different companies, so you get a lot of information. So anyway, I called SEM, got a guy named Dave, nice guy, spent about 20 minutes on the phone with him. I asked him, what does this stuff do and how does it do it? So the first thing we talked about, the weld-through primer is a zinc base, and zinc is a good metal protectant, but more importantly, it's sacrificial. If any moisture gets in between your two panels, it's going to attack the zinc-based weld-through primer first. The weld-through primer is going to take the moisture first, let it attack the primer before it attacks the metal. The next thing is, when you weld through this, what it does, instead of just burning away, it melts around there to seal it up. That way the weld is protected for any outside contaminants. So we're going to test that today. And one more thing about this primer, on the can it tells you make sure you remove any of the excess that's on your bare metal where you're going to paint. You don't want anything, your overspray, you don't want to leave it on there, so you take that off. And he said that's because being it's sacrificial, the weld-through primer is starting to break down from any moisture. It's going to take the paint with it. There's not going to be any good adhesion. Just a regular epoxy-based primer is going to be a better surface to paint over or to put filler over than the weld-through primer. And he said they do a lot of testing with this, and they do a scratch test. They'd put their weld-through primer on metal surface, and they just take something and scratch it and expose it to salt spray to test to see if it creeps underneath it or if it holds the rust where it's at. It does do that somewhat, but an epoxy-based primer does a better job of that. Also, I talked to him about the copper-based weld-through primer. The main idea behind the copper weld-through primer is just to cut down the spatter, make it a little bit easier to strike an arc, but it's not sacrificial. There's no corrosion protection with the copper weld-through primer. Okay, with all that being said, I've got these test panels I made up, and I'm going to plug weld these together with the MIG welder. I've got 6 different variations here. The first one, I'm going to weld right through bare metal. At one time, Chrysler did not want body technicians to use weld-through primer on their cars. They wanted us to weld right through the bare metal. And I'm thinking the reason is because if you're having trouble welding through the weld-through primer, your weld isn't going to be as strong as they like it. It may not perform like a factory spot weld. So I think the trade-off was you get a better weld, but you're leaving yourself open to all this corrosion that's back there. Next, we're going to do the weld-through primer, and I'm going to do like the can says, 2 medium wet coats on here. Let that dry up. Going to weld through there. Next 2 welds I'm going to do, I'm going to go over etch prime. And the reason I'm going to do that, at one time, one of the suppliers we were using for materials at the shop I was at, they recommended just using an etch prime on your bare metal as opposed to the weld-through primer. They said it welds through it easier, it's going to do the same thing. And I don't think that's the case. I think it's going to burn out of there, but that's what they were recommending. And I think we did it for a little bit and then just went back to the weld-through primer. Okay, the next, I'm going to have another spot here, weld-through primer. And when I talked with Dave at SEM, what he recommended, so you don't have any problems striking an arc through this, and it's basically the same thing I've been doing for years. He recommended just take something, just use a little screwdriver, whatever you got, and just put a scratch in there. And he said, strike your arc on that, that'll get it started easier, you'll get it welded in. I just take my pocket screwdriver, scratch all this out of here, strike my arc there, you get a nice clean weld, you got the protection around there. Okay, the next 2 sections I'm going to weld is going right through the E-coat. Now I've seen guys that just refuse to clean up anything on the backside and they'll just go right over whatever's there, the factory black E-coat. And it's not the proper way to do it because that E-coat is going to burn off of there. You're going to have gases mixing with the shielding gas, it's going to get into welds. It's not going to come out like it's supposed to. The other thing is, Years ago, I was up at the GM Training Center. They had a center up outside of Chicago. I think it's been closed now for quite a few years. But they wanted their E-coat left on the metal. They didn't want it ground off. But what they wanted us to do was use one of these little spot blasters and just go over the individual spots. You go right through your holes, and that way you get rid of the E-coat and you weld through there. I didn't like that idea. Even though you've got this clamp tight, I think you're going to get some contaminants from your sand, whatever you're using in there, that's going to get in between those two panels, and that's going to cause some problems. But that was their recommendation. They said their E-coat was the best protectant you could have on the metal. They didn't want it removed, just remove it a little bit just to weld on it. So that's what I'm going to do on these last two, and where it says E-coat removed, I'm just going to scrape it off of there. Same thing with my screwdriver, weld through there. I'm going to get these prepped again. They've been sitting for a couple of days. I'm going to run a grinder over them, get them cleaned up. I'm going to put my weld through primer on these couple spots. I'm going to put some of the etch prime on this spot, let everything dry, going to get it clamped up and welded. This weld-through primer is pretty heavy material, so you want to make sure you shake it up good. The can calls for 2 medium coats, about 2 to 3 minutes flash time in between coats. I'm going to shake this up, get it put on these couple of spots I'm going to do, and then we'll do the etch prime. Okay, I'm going to let that first coat sit up for about 5 minutes. I'll put a second coat on, and then we'll do the etch prime in here. Okay, this is the second coat. Okay, the primer's dried up enough. I've got these two panels clamped together. Now the first two welds are going to be right through bare metal. There's no primer at all in there. Second two is weld through primer, and I'm going to leave it. I'm not going to take any material out of here. I'm just going to weld right through the primer. The next two is the self-etching primer. Once again, I'm not going to scrape any of that out. I'm going to weld right through it. Fourth one is the weld through primer, and I'm going to take my screwdriver, clean some of this out of here so I can strike an arc through it. Next two is E-coat, and I'm just going to burn right through there. I'm not going to remove it. And the last two is E-coat, and I'm going to scrape that out of there. Now you won't get 100%, but you'll get quite a bit, enough to get your arc started. Okay, I'm just going to go down the line, weld these up. Now for this video, I'm using a little 110 Lincoln electric welder, and I've had this thing for years. It's a real smooth welder, welds nice, I like it. I've welded probably up to 1/4 inch steel with it, but for doing the sheet metal, it works great. And you don't need to spend thousands of dollars on a big machine. If you're just welding at home as a hobby or tinkering around with your own car, these small ones will work real good. Okay, all the welds are done. They come out pretty good. The last couple that went through that E-coat, I could really hear the difference, the sizzle and pop of the welds burning through that stuff. But so this is going to be part one of a two-part series. So the next part, I'm going to remove all these spot welds, do it as easy as possible, as clean as possible, so I could separate these panels. I don't want to get in here and have to chisel anything apart. And I want to be able to see what all the coatings look like around these welds. So in the meantime, I want you to send me some comments. What do you think is going to happen? Do you think that that weld through primer is going to melt and we'll be able to see how it protects the weld? You know, what do? Do you go right through E-coat? Do you use the weld through primer, etch primer? What kind of experiences you've had with it? Let me know what you think is going to happen when you take this apart, how it's going to look. That'll do it for this video. Thanks for watching.